Okay, welcome to the November 2019 Green Infrastructure, Climate, and Cities Seminar Series. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, this is a seminar series sponsored principally by NOAA through the Consortium for Climate Risks in the Urban Northeast, which is a 5-university consortium focusing on the impacts of climate change in this region. And we have seminars held here at Drexel on the first Wednesday of every month. The seminars are webcast, so we have attendees participating from around the country. Actually, today there's 65 folks joining us from around the country. Usually there's between 1 and 3 speakers a month. The seminars that have gone on since 2014 are all archived on the CCRON website, so if you're interested in what you hear today and you're interested in what we've been talking about in the past, feel free to go to our website and watch any of the previous talks. So the way it works is we have some number of speakers. Sometimes we have one speaker. Today we have actually a panel of speakers, and they will give their presentations, and then we have an opportunity for discussion, both for people in the room and people joining us online. Feel free to use the YouTube chat window to submit your questions, and we'll make sure that we get those questions to the speakers. We announced this last month, but I wanted to announce it again. Now we are offering continuing education credits for professional engineers for attendance at this workshop. So if you're attending, we will be happy to issue a certificate of completion, which you can use to document your participation in this series. Just send us an email, and we will send you their certificate.
Looks like an alien.
So today's topic is the first of a 3-part series that we're really excited to present, called Designing for Climate Change. And today's session in that series is about indigenous tracts. And we have 2 more sessions later on this year, actually later on in the academic year. In April, we'll be talking about contemporary tactics. And then in September, we'll be talking about implementation. And so we have a panel of speakers, and what I'll do is introduce our moderator, Shachi Pandey, and then she will introduce the rest of the speakers. And the format for today's presentation, we'll have 10-minute presentations from each of the speakers, and then a moderated discussion after that. So Shachi Pandey teaches at Columbia University's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation. She's also the founding principal of MUD Workshop, Metropolitan Urban Design. In her work, she emphasizes community-centric thinking and sustainability, and is interested in ideas that appreciate and embrace the complexity of urban, social, and economic environments. MUD Workshop is an urban design and planning firm dedicated to the regeneration of neighborhoods and public spaces. And Shachi has a master's degree in city planning and urban design, and a certificate in real estate design and development from the University of Pennsylvania. So with that, I would introduce Shachi, ask you to come up and introduce the rest of the panel. Oh, sorry, while Shachi's coming up, just a quick pitch for next month. We have 2 speakers next month talking about energy technology in buildings. We have Shanchen Hong, Pathways to 100% Clean Energy Building in Cities, and Janet Reyna on the role of building energy demand in our low-carbon future. So with that, we'll go back to Shachi.
Thank you, Franco, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being with us today. Brandt, Jerome, and I are very excited to kick off this climate series that we are calling Climate Action Series. And we think that we're at a very particular moment in history where how we respond to this phenomenon of climate change will define us in our era. And it may ultimately be the global legacy we leave for future generations. This series that we've planned is a 3-part discussion with an interdisciplinary focus. And over the next few months, we will bring together designers, policy experts, and experts from the non-design world together to learn about how their work has addressed climate variability, climate change, and climate emergency. And we will also brainstorm workable design solutions, techniques, and frameworks for adaptation. Our first discussion in the series focuses on indigenous tactics. And while we were brainstorming what that means, what adaptation actually means today, we realized that to fully understand the risks and responses associated with climate variability and change, it is not enough to just look at the state of affairs or the state of our environment as it is today. We need to also understand it in the context of how our urban areas, infrastructure, and patterns of living have evolved over centuries and will continue to do so over the next many centuries to come. Historically, many societies have been dependent on local biological diversity, ecosystems, ecosystem services, and cultural landscapes as a source of sustenance and well-being. And while there are still societies that live and operate within that framework, as our urban settlement patterns, infrastructure systems, cultures, and lifestyles have evolved, we've largely moved away from this conscious and holistic understanding of relationships between us, our environment, and our habitat. This first discussion in the series will explore what we can learn from indigenous systems of building, infrastructure, and culture that can inform contemporary best practices. I would now like to introduce our panelists. David Blumener, who's right here. He is a professor in practice at the University of Pennsylvania's Department of Landscape Architecture. David's professional practices focuses on urban plans and projects for historic districts, the rehabilitation of areas affected by extraordinary natural events, new centralities, and mixed-use districts. He has lectured extensively, written articles, and organized seminars and workshops, particularly in Latin America, for over 3 decades, motivating academics, professionals, and notably the general public to engage collectively in important issues affecting the urban arena. His work has particularly addressed social inequalities, environmental problems, and cultural erosion. His current research focuses on the notion of informal armatures, an alternative method to address the rampant urbanization in developing countries where a high percentage of population already lives and will live in self-constructed areas. David has also served as the chair of the School of Architecture at Universidad Simón Bolívar in Caracas, Venezuela. He has been the director and adjunct secretary of urban development in Venezuela and has also co-founded the urban design program and served as the director of the Mayor's Institute in the urban design at Universidad Metropolitana, Venezuela. Anna Deitch, who is joining us remotely, is an adjunct associate professor at Columbia's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation. And over the past 20 decades, Anna has worked in Sao Paulo and in New York using design to promote interaction. Her work includes planning and design of significant urban projects, as well as the design of residential, industrial, and corporate facilities in both these cities. I am going to speak very briefly about one of Anna's work that is my personal favorite, which is the Victor Civita Eco Park. This is a beautiful park that is constructed over 130,000 square foot size, which was previously the home to a garbage incinerator and designated a brownfield site. Her work has also included the urbanization of the 3rd largest favela in Sao Paulo. This might be of interest to you as well, David. And the Green Stream Linear Park, which is a mile-long pedestrian park, is designed as a bike and circulation spine to address the recurrent episodes of flash flooding in Villa Madalena in Sao Paulo. This park incorporates green building practices and water retention, diversion, and filtration systems to move water away from people's homes and businesses and into natural and constructed water drainage systems. Thank you, Anna, for being here with us today. Brandt Knapp and Jerome Haferd, who I'm going to introduce together, are the co-founders of Brandt Haferd, which is a Harlem-based architecture and design studio. Their body of work includes academic research and a range of built projects from the domestic to the workplace to the urban that challenge, and their work challenges limits of design practice. Performance and play, abstract versus built form, nature and territory are some of the interests explored in the practice. Brandt and Jerome were winners of the inaugural 2012 Folly competition held by the Architectural League of New York and Socrates Sculpture Park. Their work has been widely exhibited at various institutions, including the Storefront of Art and Architecture and at the AIA New York. And their office recently was awarded the grand prize in the Zero Threshold competition with the Accessible Housing and Side by Side. So thank you to all the panelists for being here today. I'm very excited that you all have joined us. We will have 3 presentations, starting with Jerome and followed by Anna and David. And then Brandt will open up the moderating session and I will join her. And after a brief moderation, we will open it up for Q&A for those online and those here. Yeah.
All right, so we're on a tight schedule. Can everybody hear me? And so we'll jump right into it. I am Jerome, and Shachi, thank you for the introductions, and thank you for really initiating at least the 3 of our collaboration and sort of staging these 3 discussions. This one is the first. It's a little bit of an experiment, so we're going to sort of see what gets teased out in this first go at this. And when we were deciding how to come up with this theme, we really wanted to look at kind of a broad understanding of the term indigenous. I do not claim membership or to speak in the place of specific indigenous communities, but I do think some of my work looking at sort of marginality and intersections of certain types of approaches towards design in specific places does have some commonality. And I'm really going first in a sort of introductory sense that I believe will bring out some terms that kind of come up working as, coming to this as a design professional and an academic. So some of the work that I'll show you, most of the work is student work that comes out of really confronting students with some of these ideas that have to do with what I believe to be some ideas of the indigenous, including ideas of temporality, communality, and nomadism that then tease out an imaginary that I think we'll be able to discuss. The subsequent presentations, I believe, will get more sophisticated and more expansive, looking at some kind of embedded work in a much more sustained manner. But I thought I would kind of give a sort of intro to all of this with some ideas. So beginning with the place, right? So indigenous, originating or occurring naturally in a particular place or native. And I thought I would start with the place that sort of we operate and we live in Harlem. And sort of how long does something have to be somewhere before it's indigenous, right? So this is an antebellum piece of technology that is pre-Civil War. It's a fire watchtower, sort of the kind of most advanced environmental protection technology of the time that sits atop the Mount Morris Hill, which is a piece of schist rock that rises out of Manhattan between 120 and 124th Street. This place, at the kind of topography and geography and a sort of local condition near where Brandt and I live, has become a sort of generator for design, really looking at a specific place, knowing it well, and sort of allowing even the land itself to generate a design imaginary, the kind of almost sublime condition of this piece of rock that really rises out of the Manhattan grid and disrupts it. It's been something that we've been looking at for a while and taken interest in. Looking at kind of even writing about this park, and the sort of social condenser that takes place here. For example, on the right, I guess, is the Harlem Arts Festival of 1969, and sort of looking at these sort of performances and rituals that might happen in this place. On the left is a drum circle that happens at the base of the park that still happens today. So understanding not only the kind of inert physical geography, but also the sort of more ephemeral, temporal performances and inhabitation patterns to this place. So you'll see the tower there is wrapped in scaffolding, and that's us to the left. Kind of, I'm using this as a way to sort of show you a little bit of our work and our practice, where we really got our start out of doing large public installations. So really kind of putting sort of temporary architecture into public space and allowing that, that design research and finding out ways to achieve a kind of spatial tectonic that could be erected quickly, played with, and produce certain effects over a relatively short period of time. This one was one of these follies that we placed at the top of the Acropolis while the tower was down to sort of hold the space while it was being renovated, and it has recently been restored. Just 2 weeks ago, the fire tower was returned by the New York Parks Department and placed back on the site. But this is just some of the kind of more playful work that we sort of started out our practice doing. So this installation was a sound installation as well, and you can see on the right we had to work with a sound artist to program this piece to kind of periodically, cyclically play important speeches that have been given, either related to or near the site. But again, we've really done a few different design exercises, again, very abstract, conceptual things. This is a souvenir we were asked to design for an exhibition that we decided to look really, again, at the physical characteristics of this mountain itself, and combined with the architecture and the symbolic tower as a sort of design object, again, a generator for design itself. And then, digging deeper into the kind of archaeology of the ground of Harlem and the sort of history of Harlem, maybe even before it was Harlem, or Harlem that we recognize as Harlem. And this is an 1820 map of a nearby, that features a nearby site that I've also been working with students. So here is the Marcus Garvey Acropolis that I was just looking at. And then, maybe the mouse is working. Adjacent to the river is an African burial ground site that has been the focus of a studio that I taught at City College this past spring, which again began to look at this idea of the condensement of time on a site. So even if the river has been infilled from its original water's edge, the kind of latent behavior of that water is still very present on the site. So if you then superimpose the 2050 flood prediction, the river is still there, even if we filled it in, that kind of temporal condensing on a site, and how might we design to then incorporate or accommodate something like the actual floodplain of that water's edge. So these are just some slides getting into that site. I'm not going to go into that project too much, but it does raise, again, different ways of maybe thinking about time and how we tend to conceive of time. We tend to conceive of time as this sort of linear construct, but there are other ways to kind of escape the sort of primitive, modern, ancient technological binary. So this is a little bit, these are 2 slides from that studio last spring of students looking at, again, these kind of, here we have the stepwells and different ideas of the commons and materiality, and how that might inform a different way of approaching the ground, again, in this case, that might accept the sort of ebb and flow of the river in this part of Harlem. So, these are just some terms that I think are important to bring up here that I'm interested in. Again, the temporal, the communal, the environmental are things that come up again and again. Back to this image of the Harlem Arts Festival in 1969. These events, these festivals that kind of conjure also sort of political practice, and again, temporary occupation of space, and a different way to conceive of how to occupy parks, in this case the National Mall, with encampments and these typologies that again are very temporary, but provide architecture with a way of sort of having a political dimension. Burning Man, lots of different, how to, confronting students with what do we do with architecture when this is the kind of state of affairs. And that leads into 2 courses that I'm going to quickly, because I have not a lot of time, go through that were both intro to architecture courses. So the idea here is when you're just starting as an academic, as a teacher, and as a student, what is the canon of architecture that you confront your students with? And that kind of provides them with a sort of armature or way of working, way of thinking, or way of approaching architecture and design. Those very early classes tend to really shape what someone's idea of a kind of fundamentals of a discipline are. So I decided to sort of take this idea of temporality or temporariness and have that be the sort of very first set of preoccupations that a design student, in this case not even in architecture school yet, might be understanding as a kind of canon of architecture. So this was the syllabus. You can see here a kind of mixing together of different ideas of time, the Bank of England in ruins, indigenous architecture, and so forth. And then I gave them what I would often give, and what is often given to students at the beginning of a design course, which is a precedent study. So again, we look to precedents in design pedagogy as the sort of containing our kind of inherent values of the discipline. And in this case, these are different ideas of what the primitive hut, the first act of architecture is, and the first ways that we may have built or achieved a kind of tectonic process. And you might be typically given a precedent like this kind of canonic house, Le Corbusier's Villa Savoie, as a sort of standard canonical piece of architecture. But I decided to kind of bring in some other cast of characters who bring, among other things, the dimension of time as something to also wrestle with. So this is Bernard Tschumy's famous advertisements for architecture, which depict the Villa Savoie and say the most architectural thing about this building is the state of decay in which it is. And then bringing some newer, more contemporary, less canonic examples of architecture to place alongside something like the Villa Savoie, in order to generate a temporal imaginary, a tectonic imaginary, a programmatic imaginary. The water. Of these students. So then, and I decided, why don't, as the list of precedents I give them some indigenous works of architecture, in this case, North American native peoples. Works of architecture which, might be considered primitive, quote unquote, in a sort of colloquial imagination, but really are highly intelligent, highly specific, highly specialized works of architecture as their very first cast of characters to design work around. So I'm just going to whip through the kind of list that the students were able to pick from. So the igloo, the rain house by the Papago, the round house, the grass house, the long house by the Iroquois, earth lodge, the pit house, and so on and so forth. And their first design exercise was to design kind of a toy and then an enclosure that would enclose this object. So to be generating their own new objects from the ideas that are present in these works of architecture, again, that have a kind of relationship to the land, a relationship to movement, a relationship to time that is maybe different than these sort of standard precedents that you might assign your students. And so they made these fun, objects that were kind of initially just these little volleys, sort of spatial studies. And I just running through a few of them here. Again, the toy on the left was the very first thing that a student might design, but you can even see here, for example, the wigwam is influencing an idea about how to make a wrapper or how to enclose space, which then expands into this kind of spatial armature that houses that object. I'll just quickly go through these. And they can move. They're kind of contingent objects in which are sort of gaining influence. They might not look like these Native American architectural precedents, but they're sort of influenced by the logic of those precedents. And then even the last exercise was to actually place something on a site. So this student, for example, decided to create this whole mapping of a sort of totemic object that would grow over the course of a 12-month cycle, and he made these funny little animations, really conceiving of his architectural strategy through a kind of animative sequence. And then the second course was a similar intro course that in this case was looking at ideas of territory and cohabitation as something that's kind of being influenced by indigenous imaginaries. And I gave my intro students, this time it was at Columbia's summer intro class, both humans and non-humans as the sort of 2 or 3 or 4 protagonists that might have to share a space in a kind of radical way. In this case, our site was Riverside Park, which is now on the other side of Manhattan. It's on the west side. And this is an aerial view, very sloped topography leading down to the Hudson River. And, similar ideas here, similar concepts that, again, these students, many of them have never really done architectural design before, but I'm trying to coax out an idea of a temporal imaginary, a communal or cohabitive imaginary, and an environmental imaginary. Like even our standards of comfort become very tricky or destabilized when you think about sharing space with a chicken or with a duck or whatnot. And this is just a snapshot, a very crude snapshot of the sorts of exercises I assigned them. In this case, a sort of collective territory exercise where they had to negotiate the boundaries of their design project with their neighbor in a kind of collective way. So again, I'll just show quickly 2 projects. This was a student who had initially the teepee as his protagonist, and also the bat as his animal protagonist. This student sort of did a lot of drawings and study models, kind of thinking about how do I, again, very conceptually represent a spatial habitation and a performance of this teepee, which is really a wrapper that kind of encloses both sound, air, and other things. So this is a kind of conceptual model of the sort of funnel of, I think, smoke and air that comes out of the teepee. And then he began to develop this sort of twin, Siamese twin, asymmetric twin building where the humans would sort of sleep here and the bats would sleep up here. This was another one, again, looking at the smoke. I think he actually made a video for this one. And again, trying to, make fixed conceptual models, but that are attempting to deal with more temporal ideas of enclosure and habitation. And this was the final project on the site, his drawings, kind of showing overlapped territorial zones that have to do with the bat's ecolocation or the human's ecolocation. I can't really remember anymore. And this is a cross section through. Again, these are very beginner students, but still kind of fun to see what they came up with. And then the last student in that class was looking at the longhouse, which is a kind of structure that begins with a very prototypical bay that can extend ad infinitum depending on the family structure, the family size. So she was really looking at this sort of principle, and then found images such as this one that she began to do some research into. Okay, what zone is used for storage? What zone is used for communal living? What zone is used for individual living? And sort of made a kind of diagrammatic model study that began to look at not only the tectonics or extracting some of the tectonics from the longhouse, but also thinking about inhabitation and the different spaces. So that's where she is making these kind of volumes that are coded to think about, private space, public space, storage space. And then animals are kind of running all through this all the time. So then this is the prototype being developed. She had the chicken as her protagonist. So I then took this spatial concept and began to develop a sort of architectural armature around that with this sort of, again, very experimental Warren-like space that chickens, humans could be kind of intermingled collectively in the space of the park for some temporary amount of time. So this is a model that she was working on with that. And then I don't have photos of how she began to experiment with how to enclose those different zones, but it was quite interesting. And then, so these ideas of kind of collective living, collective infrastructure is where I will end. That then segues into some much more advanced design studios and exercises like the one that Shachi, Anna, and I are actually involved with at Columbia. This is an excerpt of one of the projects that actually is ongoing right now in our urban design studio that is more sophisticated but echoes some of these concepts of sort of collective territory and collective infrastructure, how we might share backyards, agricultural spaces, rites of passage in order to have a kind of communal agricultural model, in this case, of how the cows and the sheep would move from one yard to another. Again, this is not a new idea, but in our sort of current modes of private property, it's a little bit strange to some people. And then, also smaller projects, this feeds into some of our work, where again, how do you think about infrastructure and maybe even the backyards of human dwellings as a sort of shared territory where they might have a kind of collective infrastructure. And this is I just end on this project, which is a co-living prototype that we developed recently. Thank you.
So Anna, I'll stop sharing and you can share your screen when you're ready. And you can take yourself off mute. Okay.
Yeah. Just a request, Corinne.
Corinne. I didn't see the screen. I can't see the screen when Jerome was presenting. So maybe for the. Thank you. So let me share my screen.
Hi everyone.
I've never done this at a distance, so forgive me if it's awkward and stop me if I need to do something differently. But thank you for having me, and thank you for being there. If you're away, you're in the room.
I am going to talk a little bit about my
experience with indigenous communities for the last 7 years, 6 to 7 years in Brazil. I am Brazilian, and
when Shachi invited
me and talked about explaining the
purpose of
the meeting and title as being the tactics of indigenous people or indigenous tactics. I guess I took it to a very kind of literal, in a very literal sense, and started by thinking what was a tactic, and thinking that in Brazil, at least, I think the indigenous population is very much organized around a tactic, a specific strategy. And it's not by mistake, or it's not by chance that for the last 3 decades or so, the image of indigenous people has been slowly changing, and ideologically we are starting to see them in a different way. So from being what we thought was an obstacle to progress, in certain circles, and I think in numerous circles nowadays, they are seen as a reference to some other kind of modernity. And I think this change occurred in a very strong way in association with indigenous communities' conservation capacity. When you look at this diagram in Brazil, indigenous territories and territories that are occupied by indigenous communities, they tend to be a lot more well preserved in terms of environment, 10 to 11 times more preserved than other areas. And they are fighting very strongly to conquer and build this symbolic and practical place in their public in their public identity as conservationists that are linked also to technologies that have very low impact in the environment, to, as Jerome was pointing out, a more equitable social organization, and also to specific cultural traits that are selectively reaffirmed by different conditions and different people. So to understand what this all means, in my opinion, is also necessary to make an effort to understand alterity or otherness, because when we're talking about indigenous communities and indigenous populations, we're not only talking about a different language, we're not only talking about a different place, we're really talking about a different imaginary. I think Jerome mentioned that word also, a different paradigm altogether. And in an effort to understand this paradigm, after visiting, at the beginning, when I started visiting some of these communities in the Amazon, it was very interesting, and it was very startling sometimes to see the mix between what I thought was an indigenous community and what I thought was a modern community. And trying to understand what is indigeneity, if that can be done. So, by running the risk of being very simplistic, what I think starts to be the kind of fundamental change or the fundamental difference between the way we think and the way indigenous populations in Brazil think is really how we see the world. In our high religions like Buddhism, Islamism, or Christianism, there's a very, very strong sense of hierarchy. And we are superior to nature and we are inferior to the divine. In my experience with indigenous communities, that seems to be a lot more circular. What I actually started calling to myself a circular culture or circular cultures, where man, the divine and nature are much more mingled and function in a much less hierarchical way. Things are very much related to the magical world as they are related to the natural world or the worldly man world. And the purpose and the objectives, I guess, are always very mundane and very linked to the daily life of these populations. Here in the calendar, this is a calendar, a cosmological calendar, and it's not represented as a line or as a sequence of days like we, linear sequence of days like we understand, but rather it's represented in a circle. And usually when you ask these communities to draw, some kind of calendar or some kind of organization, temporal or practical organization of their lives, what they come is up with is with a circle. And they depict this renewable cycle that connects the passing of constellations, the passing of tides, natural surroundings, and also thresholds of economic activities. So everything is very much intertwined. And I think the concept that we have, that which is not a very old concept, that could be similar to that, is really the concept of ecology. Viveiros de Castro, a very interesting kind of famous anthropologist from Brazil, he coined this way of seeing things, a meridian perspectivism. And basically, he explains it as if everything is person. There is no distinction between the natural world or the human world of object or subject. In every relationship, all the parts are subjects, and everything in that way is equally interchangeable. The spaces of the villages and the towns are also circular. And the houses, they usually define this circle, this empty space, which is the focal space. And surrounding this empty space, every building or every house is equal, stressing the importance of all members of that community. In the middle, you have the emptiness, but you also have the symbolic force of a political organization. It's interesting though, because it's a political organization that is not driven by force or coercion, but rather by mediation and convincement. In a way, the whole village is invisibly mapped by symbolic layers of meaning, and the use of the spaces is very fluid in a multi-directional frame. When the colonizers, especially the Christian colonizers, came and started dealing with these communities, they were very fast and quick to see that they needed to change the spatial configuration so that they could convince these communities to change into Christianism. They understood the force of these spaces. And this is an example of several, thousands of little villages that we have around Brazil, which have been converted from the more circular space to a hierarchical, axial, rectangular space with the church in a prominent place. Another important spatial aspect of indigenous culture is the lack of a specific immutable land demarcation. There are no lines. Borders are usually very porous. Circulation is fluid, and the spaces are demarcated by practical use, by cultural use. This is an example of the difference between a map that has been drawn by a community in Rio Negro, in the Black River Basin in Brazil, and one that we have drawn as our usual kind of mapping representation with lines and borders. And then there is a last characteristic which is very important, and a lot of people talk about it in sometimes a very romantic way, but indigenous populations have a very, very sophisticated sometimes economy of production, but it's a production without a sense of accumulation or of a lot of accumulation. And I'll give you an example of all of this by going to São Gabriel in the Black River Basin, as I mentioned. São Gabriel is an indigenous territory in Brazil. 95 or 98% of the population is auto-declared indigenous in this place. It's almost, it is at the frontier of Colombia, all the way where the forest is very pristine, and you have 24 ethnicities that still live in small settlements around the Black River Basin and the sub-basins in the area. The whole economy and logic of their lives is still very much linked to rivers and the fluidity and communication that is done by the rivers. And very much still organized as a web of economic and cultural trade among these different ethnicities. Here on the top of the screen, this white diagram shows what is currently still the trade of seeds in between the different communities and entities. So although the Amazon is very quickly being urbanized, and in this area you have cities. This is São Gabriel, and it's already 30,000 people in the middle of the forest. These communities are living still in a very traditional way, or a mix, a hybrid of traditional and modern ways, but very much linked to the tradition of manioc planting, which is the base for their culture and their survival. So whereas in urban centers like São Gabriel that I showed, you have problems with food security. In these other communities around the basin, food security is not a problem. And they're using a system of plantation, of rotational plantation, what we call today agroflorestation, that has been refined and has been working for thousands of years. Archaeological studies show that in this area of the Black River Basin, probably there was human occupation for at least 6,000 years. So what happens, and this is such a sophisticated method that the UNESCO has declared it a cultural landmark in Brazil. What happens is that there is a very specific way and time to plant things. There's a curatorial, a very defined curatorial way to do, to plant and to do the farming within the forest. So what is planted and when it's planted has to do also with the animals that are going to come, and they're going to do a cross-fertilization between the farming and the forest, so that slowly what is farming becomes again forest. And you have the cycle of agroflorestation and the forest where you had the farming. So I guess the strategy or the tactics is maybe to start seeing things in a much more long-term way, more holistic way, that nevertheless is very specific, interdependent, and aligned with technologies that are relevant to local contexts. And I think that somehow with, UN discussions about the SDGs and the Green New Deal discussion, we are starting to have starting to see this happen, starting to have this kind of more holistic vision. So instead of calculating GDPs only, we're starting to calculate, how happy a place is. And in 2016, the Washington Post had this survey with young people, less than 25-year-old kids in the US, asking them if they supported capitalism. And 50% of the people who were interviewed said they did not, which was surprising to me, especially being in the US. And in 2018, another survey from Teen Vogue kind of confirmed this tendency. 66% of the millennials answered that they didn't have savings and they didn't believe in savings for retirement because they thought that capitalism would not exist or would have ceased to exist by the time they were 60. So I guess in a very general, non-specific way, what I'm trying to say is that maybe there is a strategy that we start to adopt, and it maybe starts by reviewing some of the premises, the structural premises within which we design, less so than how we design. And that's it.
If you could stop screen sharing, then I'll take it back.
Yes.
Over. Thank you.
Yes.
And David, you're up next. Yeah, I'm gonna change the view in just a second.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. While this appears on the screen, I would like to make a small introduction. In indigenous, we heard words that are connected to the natural settings, cultural landscapes, local natural cultures. Those words were recurrent, connected to the land. I would include in the notion of indigenous the informal settlements, the self-constructed neighborhoods, the organic, the unplanned. Where already 1 billion people live today, and where we're expected that another billion people will live in the 2 next decades. And many of these communities are located in some of the most vulnerable conditions. So, indigenous for me are not only communities in more isolated locations, as we've seen before in Brazil, or in rural landscapes, but they are a significant part of the contemporary living. Shachi, in her introduction, spoke about indigenous practices that engage with this natural settling. They derive ecological services. I was taking notes for the survival and for gratifying living. She said something like that. And we can look at these indigenous practices to extract ideas that will allow us to respond to contemporary demands. You also said that. However, you also mentioned something like these communities are frequently affected by rapid change and of a very different scale in the territories they occupy, in the forces that affect them, in a changing lifestyles, and in an era of information, galloping information that they borrow from other cultures, in forms of mobility, infrastructure. So there's a clash between the traditional and the contemporary demands. And that we heard also in previous presentations. So I'm interested in the middle ground, in the transitions, in the hybrid relations that allow connecting indigenous practices with design ideas, managerial ideas, performative ideas that better allow to deal with these transitions. So that's like the overarching thing where I am. Yeah. Okay, I like this, my own quote, I'm going to use it. There are no generous landscapes, rather inadequate, irresponsive, and dangerous manners, how we relate to them. Just a general information, most of the urbanization of the millennia will occur in the global south, and especially in very large cities. And a high percentage of this urbanization will occur informally, that is with indigenous practices. And many of these sites, of these areas, are occupying the most vulnerable areas. And these are very steep slopes, floodplains, sometimes they're located next to landfills on the high power lines. So usually informality occupies the sites that official planning says that they're not fit to do so. Okay, so we're starting to get this scenario. So this condition of formal planning pushing the informal into dangerous sites makes them be in the most vulnerable locations with a significant loss, of course, of assets and lives every year. Trying to think of that, I developed these ideas that if you're interested, well, this is two of the books I published recently in the topic, but I will try to explain these ideas and go into the hybrid conditions. How you can take advantage of the dynamism of the indigenous and the informal and connect them with ideas that are planned, that are designed, that are managed, creating a hybrid condition. And in ecology, most ecologists would say that the more diverse that the system is, it is more resilient. So you're combining the strengths of the informal, of the indigenous, with the strands of the plant and the managed and the design. You would see in my presentation that there are two ways to tackle it with this. 1 billion people that live in these vulnerable conditions need a particular treatment. I am particularly interested in how we deal in a preemptive way with the 1 billion that would occupy the land before they're in serious conditions. I always say in a very colloquial way that it's easier to accompany a toddler in life than to correct devices as a serial killer at 103. No? So how do we work in a preemptive way? How do we deal with these communities in the landscape? How we give physical support, but also emotional and institutional support? And how we deal with these communities that might be first 500 migrants, 1,000 migrants that are coming from the rural area, and then up creating urban systems where, give you some numbers, 11 in Mexico City, in the informal city, 9 in Lagos, 4.5 in Lima, and so on and so on and so on. So these are not little neighborhoods. They're indigenous organizations that create huge metropolitan systems. So the demands are very complex, from community organizations to how you deal with 8 million people living in an urban continuum of house plus house plus house plus house plus house. And these are the, okay. So I will show you some ideas. I remember Professor David Graham Shane was professor at Columbia University, and he's a mentor for many of us. He says that every time you have thinkers and designers, you come up with basic schemes of organization that simplifies how we're transmitting ideas. And the way that I thought about this is that we can think in components that are essentially corridors that organize the public realm and deal with flows of people, of ideas, of agriculture. And then there are certain territories, and I depict them as these lawns. Notice that I'm not drawing them in a Cartesian way. I'm drawing them in an organic way with the idea that many of these communities are embedded in the landscape. So they're adapting to the landscapes. So the first one, in a way, are the, let's make an analogy with clams. The clams may be the homes, but for a colony of clams and mussels to live, you need a support system. And these are ropes, or they're roots or mangroves, and you need the nutrients, you need light and the water. So this is a support system that allows the plants to cling to that. And then I will try to present a concept which I call stewards, which are institutions, NGOs, witch doctors, organizations, beliefs that help to foster this and to help to foster that. So that's the general theme. I will give you some examples. So far, so good? Okay. So let's imagine that at the left is the tip of a huge informal settlement that if we don't do anything, it would cover the entire screen. And our dear Professor Ian McCart from Penn, the father of ecological thinking, he would say the first thing that you do in these territories is that you try to identify the ecological aspects that if we lose them, it would harm the community. And these basically are the watersheds, the streams, the floodplains, the rich agricultural land, the archaeological sites, the religious sites. McCart would say, we protect that. But it's not enough to map them and to identify them. How do we associate these sites so that the communities engage with them and with their practices? And we show these images that are very simple. Local agricultural practices. Notice that these are not boring designs. They're very simple interventions where the communities start understanding why it's important to protect these sites, whether for leisure, for sports, for economic reasons, for food, for healthy water. Are we okay? So that's the first move, identify these very sensitive things. Then, if you want to, the first ones were green, low energy. We try to keep them from occupation. And on the other hand, there's some areas where we would like to draw people to to keep them from occupying the vulnerable things. So let's say that along that line is a spine of activity. We want to concentrate people, and by doing them, we're easing pressure on the vulnerable sites. And how do we do that? Every culture will be different. For instance, if along that line in Zimbabwe, in Harare, where 80% of the population has no potable water, we provide potable water, that's an area that's going to attract people to it. In Medellin, in Colombia, it's not a problem. The problem was violence. They have the cleanest water in the country. Brazilians, professor, I always, don't get offended. I always say, joking, that if you place along that red line 10 soccer courts, there will be 1 million Brazilians coming like flies to that line. So each culture will be different to play this game of attracting people to the safer places and to keep them away from those areas that we have to ease pressure to. Okay? Then, I'm imagining that in order for these communities not to end up in the vulnerable sites, you have to make land available for the self-construction. So here's where you see that I'm dealing with the hybrid techniques. We're not saying people are going to stop to self-construct. They're going to use their energy and the way that they do it, but you're facilitating the process. If we did not have the armatures of support, of the pull and push, of the green and the active, and we did not provide these patches, the communities would end up in the vulnerable areas, and then we have a heavy price to pay in the future. Are we okay? And so on. So I don't want to bore you with these details, but the last component are these stewards. And here you imagine that, let's say, in conventional planning, you would say, oh, this is a good place for, let's say, this one, for a school or for a park. And if you were doing it in the States, or you're doing it in Germany, you would zone that thing. You would identify it in the plans and zone it. In the informal, in the indigenous, this area would immediately be occupied by the informal. So how do we secure this land for future demands? So let's say that what we have there on the left with the first wall is a recycling center, because we know that most indigenous communities don't go to Home Depot. They go to the landfills and they scavenge material. That is what is available. But many of the landfills combine wood and metal with medical waste. So let's say if we have an official land recycling center with technical assistance that allows to develop that first patch. After many years on the land, 5, 10 years, the communities are more established, they're urban, their income goes up, they're not scavenging material. That is a natural process. Then we move the recycling center to a new frontier, and then we can liberate the land and transform it into something else. In this case, for instance, it's a park, library, or whatever. This is what I call the stewards, whether it's the recycling center or the library. But if we don't have these stewards that operate these, you will never have these facilities that every informal community deserves. It will only be a succession of the dots. Are we okay in the idea? Okay. Anyway, and then all these elements work as an interconnected system. Now, this is only the theory. I would say, I will give you some examples, some professional and some academic, of how these ideas can be adapted to sites of different scales and different nature. Okay, I will go very quickly. This is in my country, in Venezuela. There was this horrible torrential rains on the mountain, and as you see in the picture on the left, these very innocent streams exploded into this alluvial fans. There were between, we don't know, sorry, there's a missing zero there, between 20,000 and 30,000 fatalities. This was major, just as it happened at the end of the millennium, where everybody was worried about the computer effect and the launching fireworks, so no one paid attention to us. Now, the interesting thing here, and again, why did I entitle the presentation Where Indigenous Practices Fail, is that many of these populations are coming from rural areas, as we saw in the previous case. They're being displaced by seeking a better future, better economic opportunities, or pushed out by violence, like in the case of Colombia in the 80s and the 90s. And it's happening today in Myanmar and so many other places. So you're leaving because you're attracted to economic activities, or you're pushed out by violence. So they're coming with their indigenous practices to occupy a land very different from the one they know. Okay? They don't know what the geology is. They don't know the rain patterns. They know. So what happened? all the communities were occupying these innocent streams that every 80 years or so, they expand. Not only that, in the case of Venezuela, when we did the study with the geologists and the hydrologists, it was not a 200-year flood, it was a 1,000-year flood. And it has to do with change in the climate patterns. So we're seeing that even the indigenous behavior is not connected to the land, and even the engineers and the landscapes and all that did the hydro models are being affected by new patterns of climate change. So both are failing. Both have to adapt. But that's the message in this case study. And so anyway, here we have a very bad image of a hardcore engineering solution on the left, full of garbage that drive most of the year. And then we have, with the same engineers that work with us, these ecological solutions, diminishing energy, filtering debris up, and that allowed then to the reorganization of the sites downstream. Okay. Quite simple, quite straightforward. This is another interesting case study in Cartagena. It's a tourist-oriented city in Colombia, on the Caribbean coast. And the red dot on the left is the historic district, where everybody wants to go to their honeymoon and whatever, blah, blah, blah. Anyway. And then you have on the peninsula, on the left, Miami Beach. 60-story skyscrapers, mainly money laundering. These buildings are closed, like half of New York, by the way. I'm sorry for the New York. And then the rest of the map that you see there are informal settlements that during the last 30 years came from the countryside, fleeing to the city. Now, where are they located? If I leave this place, I don't know if the microphone will lose. Notice these striations here. The coastline used to be here. Since most of the land in developing countries are very few hands because they had a colonial past, when the migrants came from the countryside to the city to seek security, better jobs, fleeing from the violence, they can't enter the real estate market. They don't have formal jobs. They're not going to get a mortgage. You have to occupy the land. You have to squat. Where do you squat? Where all the land is private? In the dangerous place? Or you invent the land? Where they invented the land in Cartagena? Landfilling the marsh by throwing debris and tires. So you can imagine that those neighborhoods with the striation, here, okay, are underwater in normal seasonal rains, have 3 feet of water during hurricanes, and in major events, they'll be completely underwater. Plus, the substrate is a mess. And for the engineers in this room to introduce sewers, aqueducts, you're dealing with a substrate that is full of debris. You can imagine how complex it is, and particularly no grade to move the waters of the sewers. This is the severity of this. Now, imagine the map on the right shows sea level rise in only 20 years. The historic district will be underwater. Luckily, it's going to be protected by the Spanish walls. Miami Beach is going to be flooded. Both Miami beaches, this one and the other. Okay? And then all the informal areas are going to be flooded. If we do nothing, another 500,000 Cartageneses are going to live on the same conditions on the edge of the water, on the dock that you see there. And why is it dark? Because it's in the floodplain occupied by mangroves. And as they occupy them, not only are they occupying the lowlands, they're destroying the defense mechanism of the barriers, and they're destroying where all the mussels are, all the clams that feed the food chain of fishery in the lagoon. It's a disaster. So what do I say in our ideas? Well, let's see if I have an image for that. Well, let's accelerate the flooding by digging the moat, which says that is a barrier. Eventually the waters would catch up, the mangrove would migrate in, and this keeps the population from coming here. But that is the stick. Don't go there. But the carrot is you have to open up an area for self-construction. If you don't have an area for self-construction, you're going to have them here. So that's against where the trick of the armatures of protecting and attracting. Is the idea clear enough? And so, this is another example in the same city. You have an informal settlement at the left. The airport was built about 50 years ago. It's a major infrastructure to receive the tourists in Cartagena. The airport is going to be underwater in 15 years. Okay? So it has to be relocated. So this is a great opportunity to be able to reshape that edge. Look what they did with the canal. They deviated for it. Of course that canal floods or doesn't flow. Okay, so this is a great opportunity to, again, open up the canal, restore the mangrove system, and with an operation of cut and fill, you raise the land for new opportunities to protect that and to extend the neighborhood, whether it's formal and informal, to the edge. So, different examples. Another example of where indigenous practices fail, and where, again, it's a formal and informal working in tandem. This devastated town is in the coast of Ecuador. Only 3 years ago, it was affected by a major quake. The reason that the towns came down with the quake is that most of the shrimp that you go to a Chinese market today and you buy boxes of shrimp, it says products of Ecuador. 20, 30 miles of the coastline, they're producing shrimps, but cultivated shrimps in ponds. They eliminated the mangroves to take the water of the streams, the saline, the brackish water, for the fish ponds. By doing so, they eliminated all the mangroves. When they eliminated the mangroves, of course, erosion began, and the coastline advanced 200, 300 meters of debris. These communities that are fishermen and clammers, moved their homes from solid ground and higher ground to the new water's edge because of the new sediments. They're not going to be 900 meters behind with the motorboats. They're right on the water. Of course, you got the quake, and you had jello. Okay? So, again, the communities know how to build their homes. They know how to produce their climate. They know how to use these materials. They're climatic friendly. They deal with the floodplain. What they did not deal is with a substrate that they were not accustomed, that would disintegrate, would dissolve in the next quake. Okay, so the solutions are not only indigenous. The solutions have to do, again, with restoration of the mangroves, foundations of pillars, foundations down to the bedrock, which cannot be done by the informal communities, which create the platform and the new bridges where they can build their homes. But without the engineering of these pillars, you can't have them. So what does the government say? They said, oh, this cannot happen again. We move everybody at level 100 meters quota, the elevation behind, and they started construction of public housing. Back, they lasted 2 days in their homes because there were boats who were in the waterfront, and they would steal their motors on their boats while they were living inland. The next day, they were already there. So that, again, explains how engineering, design, management ties with the cultural practices. Okay, and do I have a second left?
Just like 5 minutes. Just about a minute.
A minute. So I'll show the last case study. This is in Indonesia, in one of the important Samaran, in a neighborhood called Bandaharo. And I just want to show this. The neighborhood that you see here, which is one of the traditional neighborhoods of the area, very close to the port, it is next to a defunct canal that was built by the Dutch. Indonesia was a Dutch company, a colony, to link the port with the historic district. This fort was built by the Dutch. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. But this thing here is subsiding. There's been so much extraction for water that the area is sinking. So this thing is in a bowl. So there's no way that only indigenous practices can save that neighborhood with their tradition, where they make fish, with their restaurants, with their culture, with their temples. In this case, the operation that we were proposing came understanding that what you see there off the graphic to the north is the new port. So you have a major infrastructure, a national infrastructure that is building the port, and it is an opportunity to use this not only to the port, but to reshape the waterfront and to use the investment here to start reorganizing infrastructure flows. You have to create a dike here. You have to open up the flow to push the garbage out. So what I'm saying, this is important. The livelihood of this community will not be there if it's not tied to a larger operation of infrastructure and larger planning. And you're dealing, again, on one hand, with the indigenous vocation, but you're dealing with planning, with design, with engineering, working on a hybrid system. Huh? Yes.
Yeah, okay, fine.
Aha!
Like maybe easier, like towards that side a little bit more.
No, I'm fine.
You're good? Okay, sorry.
No, I'm fine. It's okay.
Okay, so we're ready to go? We're good? Well, thank you all for being here and helping this discussion. Jerome, Shachi, and I have had some brainstorming discussions and this, just thinking about this three-part series and its length, and looking at today's presentations, and thinking about how we can continue this dialogue. That it has more to do with, I guess, climate and how small practices can impact. There's lots of discussion right now in terms of climate action and the Green New Deal, and we can talk about many, many things as it relates to that specifically. But with this series, we were trying to think about what are interests that we, the three of us, have, and how can we facilitate a conversation. And with these three presentations today, I think it's a great jumping off point because, you know, Jerome starting with the pedagogy of architecture and how we teach in first-year studios, or even before you even decide to be an architecture major in the first class you were mentioning. So that type of just thinking in the way that we were educated in this kind of Western canon,
Right.
looking at precedents, like just rethinking that narrative and how it relates to not just, I guess, sustainability and climate action, but also logics and tactics. To then, you know, think about Anna's presentation in more of an anthropological way, and she has design projects as well that were shown, but I think looking at a particular community to see how, you know, their customs and this idea of circular cultures that we, I guess, as you know, we know that innately, I guess, when we understand even going to a museum, and I've lived in Arizona for a while, so I've been to even powwows and things like that. I think we have an understanding of that, but to hear someone talk from an anthropological perspective was really great. And then, David, obviously, these projects that you showed are extremely intense, and I love this idea of hybrid and knowing that even though we're super curious about how young contemporary practices can start to mine the indigenous, but it's absolutely necessary to think in a hybrid way. So I guess my first question to start us off, because I think you talked about this, you didn't use the word, but both Jerome and Anna did, is to think about what this imaginary is. If we can kind of try to define what an imaginary, you know, one thing is we are in a College of Engineering, and so maybe we're a little bit outside of our own, and I'm not certain, I'm curious where to interact with you all, because I guess I'm wondering, for us, like even though we didn't talk about it today, maybe you even saw it, but aesthetics are something that's important. We talk about the built environment, and maybe, you know, when you were talking about the substrate, like your eyes went, oh yeah, now we're there. But I guess I'm curious when we have this discussion of an imaginary, how would you define this and relate it to indigenous?
Yeah, I mean, I thought the three talks were really interesting in that, in a sense, they sort of almost discuss different populations. Like in a way, my framing of it was more kind of looking at us as in sort of like contemporary North American Western subjects and how we might change our own minds and kind of inhabit a different paradigm for ourselves. Whereas, you know, Anna and David are sort of looking at maybe these more specific populations and their practices or their vulnerabilities in your case. But yeah, I guess the imaginary is a hybrid condition, right? Where, you know, there's no like going back to some kind of nostalgic place. I think in any of the three talks that we're you know, and actually the Zizek, Slavoj Zizek he did a recent piece on ecology and the sort of how we tend to view nature as this sort of static entity, but nothing is static. And I thought your presentation got that across, where we're always dealing with a sort of a new condition, and we can maybe learn and adapt from a previous or a sort of other ulterior culture to our own. But whatever comes out of that is going to be something entirely new and different. So, you know, that's the sort of the idea that we're always mixing a kind of our own lived experience, our own technologies, with maybe an ulterior culture, but then both of those things are coming in contact with a sort of biosphere or ecology that is always changing as well. So it's a constant moving target. There's no like return to something prior.
I would like to connect to that.
Please.
Because that's one of the words that I was writing. I take my notes and I
Not texting.
scatterbrained. I'm not texting, which everybody thinks I'm so the first thing I wrote was changing conditions.
Yeah.
Nothing is static. So you're changing, and that is a very different state of mind for designers and for engineers and for practitioners. We are designing frameworks that have the opportunity to morph, to adapt. And that's very different of the way we were trained in the past. So that's a big message that I would get to in the engineering school. The other thing is that there are no standardized conditions. You can't apply solutions across the board. They have to be, I mean, there's a logic of the solutions, but if you don't understand the context and make them site and culture specific, you're bound to fail.
Yes.
No, so that would be my second
Yes.
piece of advice. Then there are many other things. For instance, how do you engage with the communities that you're working for? Because eventually what you're doing has to be accepted by the communities. And in a way, not only accepted, share with their culture, being participative of them, and then as quick as possible, you hand it over to the community. If not, the projects will eventually go down the drain, especially when you're working in developing countries with limited resources. So let me, just an example going back. I don't go into detail in the Ecuador, in the Chamangas thing. We consulted the best expert in mangrove restoration, which is Mr. Shetman, who is one of he's maybe now close to 75. He's maybe one of the best well-known landscape architects in Latin America, and he works in Mexico City, his office, but he's developed mangrove restoration projects in the Yucatan Peninsula. So we consulted with him how he operates to ensure the survival of the mangroves. How do you do it quick? How do you plant them? How deep are the boxes? How quick can you make them with wood, whatever? So we got the technical advice. But this would not operate if you're not teaching the community in Chamanga how to do it. And you start with the schools, with the fisherman organization, and it will not work either if you don't give them an economic stimulus to spend 2 hours of the fishing day to compensate for the time they need to plant these things. If not, they will be clamming. If they don't, so there has to be a government subsidy there. And if they do it, 20 years from now, they can restore the mangroves that it took 10 years to destroy. But again, you have to do it with the community.
Right. But I do want to kind of, because I think a lot, right now there's a lot of use of words like repair and restore in relationship to kind of ecological consciousness or climate threat. I think there might be a more appropriate word is almost like recombinant or sort of, again, imaginary, because it, you know, in some of the images you showed, it's almost like there's, yes, it's being restored, but it's going to be something new.
Yeah.
Completely.
It's something new entirely. You know, it's not that I'm taking issue with restore, but only because I think it's actually something more radical that's happening.
And by the way, going to an engineering school, the two aspects, and going back to the expertise of people, you have to work in a very interdisciplinary way. There's no way to attack these problems if you're not working with experts in biology, in water management, in sanitation, in social work. I mean, so the projects will be so complex that you have, without losing your strengths in your expertise, you have to be able to cross over boundaries. That is extremely important. That's another component that I would push.
Anna, do you have, on this topic of the imaginary and responding to any of their comments, do you have anything to add?
Yes, no, I think when I was putting together the presentation, I was aware that I was showing something that is very, remote and, pertains to the villages of indigenous communities. But I think there is something that we need to also think about in the discussions that we're already having in terms of, the whole world being urbanized and what is urban and what is rural, and what do we do to remediate, to restore, to use these words that Jerome was talking about. But there's also, I think, a need to look beyond what the city is, and to look to this idea of extended urbanism, and to look and see how is it that we're going to deal with these lush natural environments. I think this is something that's really hard for us as urban designers and landscapers and architects. And like David was saying, maybe it's the preemptive action that we need to have. The Amazon is burning, and it's not metaphorical, right? I mean, it's being consumed. I was in July in Xingu, in the middle of Brazil. I had to cruise 5 hours in a car at 70 miles an hour of soy fields to get to the forest. So I think it's a very interesting also proposition for us to, define what is natural. And I think then the imaginary of what is indigenous, be it, understood by indigenous populations in an anthropological way or pertaining to a site or pertaining to a place, I think it's very important. And I think I don't think we know how to do it, because I don't see a lot of designers involved in the discussion in the Amazon, for example. I see a lot of ecologists, a lot of farmers, a lot of economists, maybe some planning, but no science.
That's a really good point.
Design. I would like to add something, and maybe, because I'm a bit older than most people in this group probably. At my time in design schools, not in engineering schools, but in design schools, we were labeled as formalists. We were only dealing with form, with aesthetics. They're sissy, right? Your generation now deals with all these things that are in the agenda, with systems, with performance.
Right.
So it's all, you're dealing, these words you repeat daily. Sea level rise and climate change, remediation, water sufficiency, food sufficiency, clean energy, and Green New Deals. And you can go through the list of the 100 things which are part of your generation. However, as I said in the presentation in Colombia, the design component that creates the meaningful places that are loaded of beauty, of meaning, of aesthetics, of identity, that sustain these processes is a very important component, because people are attached to the natural landscapes, and they cry, they suffer when they're destroyed like the Amazon, but they also engage with beautiful places that are constructed, that are designed. And if these beautiful places have the opportunity to perform all these great things, then we're closing the loop.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that, the visualization of an imaginary is something that architects are actually really well, positioned to do. And to hear Anna's point that, where are we in the discussion or the project of the Amazon in architecture schools right now? We had our mid-review season the last 2 weeks, and this conversation came up twice for me with, should we be building, right? So I do think that right now, there is also this realization that we, in this kind of capitalistic world that we've been in, where we've been develop, build. We don't know how to have a project unless, you know, we have something to design and build and construct. I do think that we might even, as young practices, we should think about this as to how we might have agency in other ways. Shachi, it looked like you wanted to say something.
Well, you know, I'm still kind of stuck on this concept of imaginary.
Mm-hmm.
And Anna, you spoke about circular cultures philosophically, you know, how the indigenous population in the Amazon is building within this context of a circular culture and, you know, not a hierarchical culture. And David, you mentioned about, you talked about managing self-constructed environments. And to me, both of these concepts are so different from the way we build today, the way we build, the way we plan, or the context in which we build and plan, the political, economic, and social context. So I'm wondering what fundamental philosophical change do we need to adapt now? Because I feel like this is, you know, a very particular moment. What fundamental philosophical change do we need to embrace, and how do we, you know, see it? How so that we have so that people, communities have the agency, so that you know, we as practitioners in the built environment have the agency, and it's not just a you know, it's like a top-down approach to building. Because both what you have described and what Anna has described is a very holistic and bottom-up way of. Brandt, want to see you?
Yeah, I just
Yes.
wanted to piggyback off of that, because I was having a very similar reaction, like just to this whole discussion. I mean, kind of try to sort of gauge other people in the room in this, but you know, the whole idea of climate, that the future is not the same as the past, suggests that restoration isn't appropriate, because in some sense, right? In some sense, restoring is not necessarily the way we have to think about our future, because what has been the cycle of things in the past is not going to be the cycle in the future. And I'm assuming that that's what you mean by the imaginary, which, you know, is then conceiving something new. But I see sort of a conflict, which I think is what you were getting at, between, on the one hand, this sort of like circular cultural approach to things that, you know, we're talking about as somehow, you know, able to persist through generations, right? It has shown thousands of years in some of the examples that were shown. You know, on the other hand, we have a sort of top-down, I know best, the future is different from the past. The designers, and here's where architects and engineers, I think, come from a very similar perspective. You know, it's a very quantitative and analytical perspective, where we come in and say, you know, I'm here to help you.
Right.
Yeah. So where's the conflict then? And you know, how do we not inadvertently replicate the same kind of patterns of destruction that we're talking about here? You know, that there's, on the one hand, we want to create something new. At the same time, we want that new thing to respond to unknown, uncertain conditions. And we want to do it in a way that is respectful of cultures that we are worried we're losing.
Right.
And so that's a conflict here.
I think I'll just add in here, but everyone wants to talk, and we want to hear from the others. I do think that I think some of a better approach that's coming through in some of the presentations, and also what I think about a lot is the sort of acknowledgement that even time and change exists in the design process and in the innovation process. I think we've been through the 20th century where a lot of what was rolled out was always being rolled out as this kind of definitive answer that did not even acknowledge that was sort of not international style.
Yeah.
It's for any culture. This is just the way it's going to be. And almost almost without even a sensibility that allows for this morphing or that accepts that this too will change or degrade.
I think that's a really good point. You'd mentioned, designing for unknown things, like let's say some 1,000-year flood we might not know about, or how our changing climate patterns are taking place. But, in your work, you talk a lot about very specific things and specific communities to design for that type of, tabula rasa or international style never took into consideration. And then things didn't work and there was devastation, and especially the examples that you've shown. So I guess, this issue of time and change and being adaptable and flexible is something that's really, I think, important. And you also mentioned, to not have, let's say one type of system, but multiple types of systems, right, that work simultaneously.
But then again, on that, I think we should also open it up to others. But I'm also wondering, David, what and Anna, to you as well. This question goes to you as well. How do we then deal with this question of sort of emergency? If we have this, say, decade deadline, or we're trying to, is this something we should embrace as well? As a Green New Deal?
Well, I think that the question of emergency and to act with limited resources and quick also has to do with the issue of top-down, bottom-up.
Right.
Maybe, I try to give examples. For instance, in the project that you may know of the African the Green Wall of Africa, the project is trying to counteract desertification because the desert, the Sahara, is moving down. Climate change is drying the area and it's moving into the areas that were not deserted. So there's a problem that they envisioned this Green Wall of Africa as scientists got together, environmentalists got together, and we had a major problem. All these countries where millions of people have their livelihood and their water and their agriculture and also biodiversity were going to be dry if the trend continues. So what was the project envisioned, maybe in a small room with scientists and with governments, is saying we can establish a band that runs east from west in the border between the desert and the greener zones, oversimplifying them. And that is a major top-down idea.
Yeah.
But the implementation of it is thousands of projects that work along the band, identifying soils, community organizations, agricultural practices, different institutions, national parks, water management agencies, engineering firms. So it's a combination between big ideas that is saying, and then the operation of it, the implementation, is local and it goes down all the way to the grassroots. I think that's a good example.
That is a great example. We have 20 minutes at most, and I, of course, have more questions, but we want to engage as much as we can with you all while we're here. So,
and I believe that there are a lot of people online as well.
That also might have
and
questions.
Corinne, you could just let us know their questions.
Yeah.
I saw someone have their hand raised though, but so.
Yeah, I think embedded in the idea of indigenous practices, there is this interesting, past opportunity to observe change. So you were talking about many cities growing because people moved to cities. And so in some way there is change for those people who used to have indigenous practices somewhere else. And now they've changed in the way that they are choosing to live. And so how do fixed structures interact with people who are willing to make changes? And we project increased urbanization to continue, right? So I think that there's an environmental change that you're talking about, but we already have this history of a population shift that could also inform the way that we design for uncertain environmental changes. So could you speak to urban practices that may be more amenable to those?
I can give a little example. For instance, in what I tried to explain, that we have this challenge ahead of new migrations coming to the city. They're mainly coming from rural areas, although maybe they're not similar, but they have rural practices, agricultural practices. They're connected to the land, they're farmers, whatever. When they come to the cities in these unplanned settlements, in 5-6 years, their skills are gone, and they don't pass them on to the next generation. But in my proposal, it says these armatures have to provide land for community agriculture within the neighborhoods that not only allow them to use their skills for their own benefit, for sustainable living, but to produce agriculture that they can sell into the city.
Yeah.
And therefore, maybe what they were doing, the reason that they left the rural areas is that they were not economically sustainable. So there are two ways. Or we strengthen the rural areas, or we understand that the migrants that come to the city have rural skills that they can use in a way to even make more money and integrate to the city. So again, it becomes a hybrid system, okay? But you have to provide the fiscal conditions and the managerial conditions for that to occur.
Right.
I think that's like a remarkable vision, and it would be fantastic if that could be implemented. I'm curious if there are any things we can learn about cities that have expanded with migrant populations that have worked well for the uncertainty, right? Like that aspect of the city was probably not designed for the migrant population to come, and now it has actually adapted appropriately to change that was unanticipated.
Well, again, I would take the case of Medellin, for instance.
Medellin and Bogota.
Medellin and Bogota.
Yeah.
You know, for me, Medellin, when you say it is a city where 50% of the population, did you see the series Narcos? The series Narcos?
Oh,
The
yeah.
Narcos, it explains a period of top extreme violence in Medellin in the 1980s, when it was the epicenter of the drug distribution. It was literally the most dangerous city on earth. With these interventions in the informal settlements, providing better connectivity with the gondolas, creating public libraries in the heart of those areas that have no education, opening public space, taking people out of the floodplain and relocating them within the same neighborhood, creating amphitheaters, bringing Shakira to the amphitheater. I mean, it was a holistic observations. These neighborhoods that were so challenged are vibrant parts of the city today. You know, so there is hope in reshaping and adapting, and if they wouldn't, these operations of the library, of all that I described, there was no way that the result would have been the same if they were designing a new town with public housing.
Right.
They're unique because of the human substrate that is there.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
In a specific context.
In fact, I think in Medellin, it was the system of stewardship and these corridors and those islands, what did you call them?
the patches.
The patches was an overlay on top of the already informality and the informal settlement on the hills and the mountains, right? So this kind of like came in. So it wasn't it's the other way around. It wasn't something that was first a framework that was created for the population to come and settle. It was
The framework was
the
introduced.
framework was kind of introduced within an existing settlement pattern.
I'm curious, Shachi, just if you have any examples from India that kind of correlate with some of this, of your experience.
You know, I have to say that in India, all of the cities are managing urban in-migration very poorly. The systems of infrastructure in the country, especially in India, has had urban areas that date all the way back to 1500 BC in some cases. And there have been very, very sophisticated infrastructure systems. One that we were discussing on our train ride here, the step wells, right, which is also on our poster here. These wells were systems of collecting, storing, and discharging water into main rivers, and collecting water from tributaries and discharging them at a controlled rate. And they functioned really well. There were no flash floods. There were, because it's the same sort of logic that we use for water management in cities today, but the scale at which these infrastructure systems were designed with a city-wide level was very, very sophisticated understanding of topography, of soil systems, of where people would live. Some on the lines of what you're describing. These corridors were really protected, and they have lived over generations.
Right.
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 And but now, because we've kind of built in a manner, and urbanization has happened at such a rapid rate that we've forgotten this whole the initial, the permeability of the soil, for example, that fed the system, the connection with the river, the connection with the nalas, the tributaries, all of that kind of seems to be broken, and these now, instead of a system, are functioning as individual elements of the system, and therefore barely functioning. So again, an indigenous system that
Well,
is...
and that's where I think the sort of rigidification also of like private property.
Oh,
for example,
absolutely.
and
That is
real
what I
estate
wanted somebody to
has kind of,
address.
is another system that gets
Yeah,
overlaid on top.
because there didn't seem to be such a hard line in terms of my property and I build here and this is what I can do here, and no more easements for whatever, complete rights of ownership. I think that has been something that has really, really changed the way we think about larger systems, landscapes, and building in general. It's not sustainable at all.
So before we keep talking, we should see if there are questions. Are there any online?
No, we have a quiet audience.
Okay. You do have one here, so.
I don't know that it's really a question, but I like about the boundaries. I thought that was really interesting. I think Anna was saying that the boundaries should be fluid and kind of things can move around. But as an engineer, day to day, you have this is your property or this is one municipality and you have to follow their standards. But if you were across the street building the same thing, it would be different because you're following someone else's standards when they're not really. Both of them work, but they're just kind of made up standards a little bit.
I mean, it's funny because all these codes and regulations are there for us to build properly and for public safety and all of this, but with these, a lot of people mention time and context and being local as something that's indigenous, and you even mentioned when people moved to that area in Venezuela and they didn't know about the way that the slides happened, so on and so forth. I mean, there were, and you look at some of these indigenous practices, some of them huge, like the stepwells, this is a huge network of systems, or I mentioned that I lived in Arizona where I did my undergrad, and that canal system that used to be in place there is extremely sophisticated. But again, these types of codes weren't even a thing. I think that there's a deep knowledge and a deep research that comes through generations, passing one thing to the next, and the way that we've kind of studied in university in our disciplines and has at times made for the research to not be as expansive and as specific to particular cultures and particular places and particular environments. And so that's one thing that I really gained from all of the topics, that you need to know exactly who's moving there and exactly what their needs are, and if they're fishermen or they're people who work the land and how they work.
And it goes back also to what Anna was describing, the concept of limited accumulation. Even property,
Why waste?
Why waste? Limited accumulation versus, just lots of accumulation. This, ethos that we've woken up to today.
I'm into giving examples today. Based on the, you asked some questions had to do with advocacy and also the hybrid engagement between indigenous practices and design skills, managerial skills. I go back to my homeland. In Caracas, it's a very steep valley in a highly seismic area. And it's not like Chile or Japan that quakes every other day as we speak. Energy accumulates and the frictions occur every 80 to 90 years. Bump.
Wow.
The informal settlements grew up between the last quake and one that is expected to come in the next decade from 2 stories, height average, to about 12. So as any engineers know, this is okay, but that is not okay. Okay? So we know that the next quake there's going to be 500,000 people dead. Okay? And they keep on going up because there's no land. The entire city is surrounded by national parks. So the formal city is high-rise, is Hong Kong, and then formal is high-rise. So there you have a major problem that's going to affect the lives of many. Advocacy. How do you come across with a word of alert that there has to be some sort of engineering solution because they're constructed there? You just can't say cut the buildings. You know, there's some sort of framework that provides elasticity or whatever. 2, how do you get people that are still in the 4 to 5 story not to build higher? There has to be codes, there has to be some way.
Yes.
And 3, which is another major problem, in the case that there is an event and these things come down, there's no areas to evacuate because there's no land where people can run while the houses are falling. There's no way to do rescue operations after the houses are down. So this is a major problem of design and advocacy, of communicating to the politicians and to the communities that we have a problem.
Right.
No?
Yeah, and I think that touches on what I was hearing in your question was also like, how do we bridge these political divides? And I think, you know, all of the professions, you know, designers and so on and so forth, first of all, it ties back to the interdisciplinarity, the essential interdisciplinarity towards having better responses to the systems. Also, if the design communities, be they engineering or architecture, are voicing these concerns and you know, putting that into our vocabulary, it does affect sort of those decision-making processes. But it's really an interdisciplinary thing.
Yeah, and I think even when you go for, let's say, a variance, right? You know, what is the bureaucracy? I mean, there's a systematic kind of issue. I mean, and you know, some of these conversations were started with this conference about the Green New Deal, and you know how we could possibly, as young practices, like start to implement ideas and what could you do? You know. So it's interesting, like with this 3-part series, next time we'll talk more about the small practices, and then the 3rd one will be mainly like implementation. So it's great that we start to think about things like even lots, you know what I mean, that are adjacent to each other, with how, you know, we might be able to find new ways of presenting things to, you had a question, yes?
I just want to say, I mean, presumably the circular culture that Anna was talking about was preceded by a long period of adaptation, right? Where things were tried that didn't work, things were tried that worked, and eventually, you know, there evolved a way of sustaining a lifestyle in the landscape. And, you know, that to me is sort of like one pattern. You know, another pattern is this sort of I know best top-down standards approach that I think many of us are still guilty of, even in the context of climate change. That, and I'm speaking, you know, personally, you know, I'm being guilty myself, in that, you know, to deal with these crazy situations that we're facing, we have to do this, right? And so to me,
solutions.
Yeah, but yet what's interesting to me is that the failures that David is talking about are I see them in one sense as a coping, it's an interim coping mechanism. It's an attempt to adapt to a system that has not yet defined itself and perhaps won't, because it's going to be continuing to change.
Right.
Which makes designing right now very different than designing in the past, because it's a moving target.
Yeah.
And that's really interesting to me, because it suggests, maybe we're not looking backwards. Maybe restoring is not correct. But then, you know, it gets into this hybrid idea. But what I feel is missing in the discussion so far, though, is how does the hybrid idea, how is it an adaptive hybrid idea? You know, how does it sort of evolve the way those circular cultures that Anna was talking about? How do we ensure that process is built into what we're doing right now? I still don't think we're there.
Right. I do, because we only have literally 2 more minutes. Anna, do you have, it's because we have to like call on you for you to be able to speak up, it's because you're not here. So please, do you have any thoughts?
Well, I think I agree with David, and I agree with, I don't know who was speaking.
Franco.
I think what I was trying to say is that not only we have to have hybrid technical design solutions, but I think, like David talked about, the example of the Green Wall in Africa, there was what he called a top-down solution. I don't know if I would call it a top-down solution, but there is a frame work and a frame of mind that needs to change so that we can discuss structural principles of how we're going to work, right? And it has to do with design. It has to do with everything we do. And it has to do with this adaptation, like how do we train ourselves to think structurally differently. And we're not going to erase the cities of the world. We're not going to erase zoning. We're not going to erase poverty just because we want to. But I think we can slowly go back to a discussion that includes what these circular, cultures include, which are a little bit more of communal space, a little bit more of, care of what natural is, a little bit more understanding of the connections between the vertical section of where you're working, right? The cultural traits, the natural traits. I don't know. I'm not responding exactly to what.
These are a great.
I think it's and that's why I think the Green New Deal is so interesting. Mm-hmm. Although I still see it as, or maybe because it is some kind of a manifesto, right? Mm-hmm. Not really a policy. And it's going to become 1,000 policies, I think, yes. Like David said. But we need to agree that there is some kind of structural principle or structural principles that we work with. Mm-hmm. And when we're talking sometimes to our students at Columbia, they don't even understand really what the concept of social democracy is. Mm-hmm. Social democracy has existed not that long ago. So I think going back to extremes or examples or some kind of very different examples of how these indigenous cultures live in the Amazon, in India, and it's universal in Mexico, all over Latin America. It's because one, they're here, they're not a fantasy, right? And they remind us that we should, and could live in a different way, and we have.
Great.
Bravo.
Thank you.
Bravo.
I was gonna say, if you have any final last words, you have this.
I wanted to just, I think I agree with everything that Anna said. It is really just it's a totally different value system shift, I would say. And I think that in that case, the Green New Deal is really powerful because even though it very simply acknowledges that we are here today because of human activity, I think even acknowledging that to me is a big structural change or a big shift in the value system that, we can't just ignore it for it to go away or embracing it and understanding that that where we are today is something that's man-made. It is not just a part of a cyclical environmental change or course. And I think that we want to probably discuss also. I used 3 different words today: climate variability, climate change, and climate emergency. And I think that in our future panels, along with everything that we've heard today, maybe dive a little deeper into what these 3 different terms really mean and translate in the way we continue to build our urban landscapes. But there's just so much food for thought.
Yeah, we're happy to
today, and
listen to
we'll be shaping the next discussion series with all of this feedback. Thank you so much, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you. So to all our listeners, we have next, the first Wednesday of December, we have our next series, but the next part of this series is in April. So join us for December and every session between now and April. And thanks again to our panelists. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.